Good evening and welcome to another edition of vBrownBag. Today we are continuing the API series that we've begun, and we're going to continue this today talking about how to use RESTful APIs. So the last episode we talked about what it is a RESTful API, so we're just continuing that same conversation today. Feel free to join in on the conversation. I'm here. You can always tweet at me, or Tom. He is our lovely co-host. Or, of course, tweet at vBrownBag, and use the hashtag vBrownBag. We've got this episode happening this week, and then we're going to continue our API series for the next few weeks on Wednesday night. Also, tune in to the other channels that are geographically appropriate for you. Tonight, we have a special guest that's going to be presenting with us. I'm privileged to say that I actually work with Peter. So Peter Milanese, he's going to be talking today about using RESTful APIs. Are you ready to blow our minds, Peter?
Absolutely.
All right. So you are now the presenter. Take it away.
Let me figure this stuff out really quickly.
Yeah, close all those inappropriate windows.
Yeah. I tried to do a little cleanup on the laptop prior. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. So thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate you taking the time to log in and kind of hear what I have to say about, in a general sense, using a RESTful API, what it can bring to the table, and get some actual code and looking at demonstrations of how we can easier facilitate functionality in various aspects of the gear that we manage, the infrastructure that we architect, that type of thing. My name again is Pete Milanese. I've been with Rubrik since January of this year. Prior to that, I had the privilege of leading the systems engineering team at the New York Public Library. I held that position for about 15 years, and then I kind of just I felt for no other reason than I want to do something new and exciting. Rubrik happened to feel the same about me, and now I have the privilege of working here and evangelizing and helping organizations to see the art of the possible as far as integration with our particular solution, as well as others, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down the deck. Cool. So there are three main topics that I want to cover over the course of this conversation, and all obviously revolving around the RESTful API. But how do we get basic things done, right? How do we log in? Most APIs out there, most RESTful APIs specifically, will require some sort of authentication. It doesn't have to require some sort of authentication. There's certainly public domain APIs available, museums, libraries, that kind of thing, that might not require authentication to access the data sets. Certainly any on-premises, and I think I got that right, Rebecca, any on-premises solutions would be more tied down and require some form of authentication. So we'll touch upon these two. We'll touch upon basic authentication, and we'll touch upon token authentication, and we'll kind of cite the differences between them. Obviously, there are other forms of authentication that we won't touch upon in this slide deck, but there are other ones to be aware of. Obviously, the plethora of versions of OAuth are something to be aware of, and something that third-party applications tend to offer is API key, which is another form. All of them are methods to identify yourself. I apologize for that transition issue. We'll just build it out. So the second thing is, how do we actually call a RESTful API? So there's this metadata, this information, these processes that we can invoke. How do we do that, right? And we'll go into conversations on how to do it without code, which is, there are tons of facilities out there that will allow you to test out workflows. Say you're whiteboarding a workflow, you want to prove it out without actually writing code. There are tools out there to help you to do that. We'll also obviously talk about how to do it with code. Then we'll talk about writing code. So a simple form of writing code in order to call a RESTful API. We'll talk about that briefly, and then finally, and it tends to be the larger topic, pardon me, but we'll talk about more advanced forms of writing code. So we're going to go into CI/CD, the definitions of those, some best practices, and a very high-level view of where you can go with this type of development. So let's talk about authentication for a little bit. As I said before, there are two forms of authentication that we will be going over in this discussion. There's the basic authentication and token-based. So let's dive right into it. So the slide has a bunch of information on it. It's very high level, but it essentially sums up the purpose or the meaning of basic authentication. And there are actually needs or circumstances where I favor this over token-based authentication. And after we discuss both of them, I'll kind of shoot out my opinions on both of them. You see a bunch of Ruby code in front of you, but let's just kind of blind our eye to that for the moment and talk about the bullet points here. So basic authentication will allow you to maintain a connection to a REST data source. And essentially what that means is with basic auth, you're passing your credentials every time that you submit a request to the endpoint, right? So, and in contrast, token, which we'll talk about in a moment, it doesn't do that, right? So you essentially pass your credentials once, and you'll find some security guys that kind of aren't keen on that. Other security guys are obviously both sides of the spectrum, so they kind of feel that that is the way to do things, and just make sure everything's encrypted properly, right? So you can support a long-running process using basic authentication, and the simple reason for that is that a token times out. Some places have configurable timeframes, like you can specify how long you want a token to last, or a session identifier. And in other cases, they kind of hard code it and they say, hey, you have 30 minutes to use that token in the case of like a managed service or something like that. And then you have to refresh the token or re-authenticate in order to get a new token to continue your workflows. And in basic authentication, it essentially takes a concatenation of the username and password and passes it as a base64 string, which is not hard to figure out if you know it's passing a base64 string. So that's why the important thing is to make sure you're running over secure connection. So make sure you're SSL or TLS, which is the new favorite thing, and make sure that transmission is secure. So diving into this code sample, and this is actually a piece of code that is from one of the frameworks that I wrote that kind of acts as the main framework that I develop upon when I put new use cases into the Rubrik repertoire, right? So this is used all the time. Essentially what I'm doing here is I'm defining my connection. I favor the Faraday libraries, and this is Ruby code. I probably said that before, but I tend to write in whatever language fits the situation. So in Ruby, I tend to prefer the Faraday request module because it's very robust. It'll handle pretty much anything you want to do. So essentially what I do is I specify the basic auth variables, which consist of username and password, pretty plain and simple. I then specify the header as authorization. Now, in my lab, I don't have actual SSL certs on my endpoint, so I turn off the verification so that I can access that. You might have that issue with hitting vSyn or any number of things. You might have that same issue. You have the ability, if you know your environment is otherwise secure, you can safely set that to false. It's probably not the best thing to do in any case. But it'll certainly get you through it. Then I'm actually launching the connection. So the response equals connection.get and a space P, which is actually my endpoint that I'm going to hit. It it's actually making the call. So that's lighting the call. So I get a response back. So when that response comes back, I need to decipher what it is, what we're doing, what the messages are that comes back. Is it valid? Is it not? So I do that. I do that here as well. But all the while, the important thing is with basic authentication, you're passing the username and password every time you make a call. It's not once. It's not, you know, every once in a while. It's every hit. And when you get involved in complex workflows that have many operations going on, you might have it threaded, so on and so forth. It can be, you can be passing that username and password over the wire thousands of times a second, very easily. So moving on to token authentication, and this is more of a fair example, because this actually displays just the obtaining of the token or the session ID, however you want to term that. So with token authentication, you're essentially telling your REST source that you want to do some stuff, right? So it's a pretty simple concept. You're authenticating once in the beginning of your workflow or your session, or however you manage your token refreshes, is how many times you're going to actually pass the credentials over the wire. So it serves as a temporary connection. And what I mean by that is that, like I said when I was on the basic slide, you have a time frame that you need to complete your workflow. If your workflow is long running, there's a good chance that your token is going to expire and you're going to be denied access to continue that workflow. So you kind of have to choose wisely on how you want to handle it, because you can have a lot more code if you use token authentication in order to institute a refresh of that token, which might not be the right thing for your use case. So obviously you need to refresh a token if it does expire and your workflow is not complete. I've seen this in cases where specifically data moving. So in one of the workflows that I'll go into briefly later in the conversation is dependent on a vMotion, a storage vMotion. Depending on the infrastructure, storage vMotions can not be so nice, right? So essentially what needs to happen is at some point during or after that vMotion, you might need to refresh a token that a workflow after that vMotion depends on. So that's kind of thing that you need to look out for, because you can have a lot of failures, and it's as simple as that, because your token required a refresh. And the really good thing about token auth is you're only passing your credentials at the beginning of the session, which really kind of puts a lot of minds at ease. Although, like I said on the basic slide, if you have that encryption end to end, it shouldn't be a huge concern. Certainly on infrastructure, on internal infrastructure, on premises, or VP, a VPN, VPC, it should be fine to run just basic auth. But you might have use cases where you're hitting an external endpoint that is not under your control, and they require token authentication. So those are two of the major use cases for authentication. So I'm going to segue into kind of like basic. I've heard about APIs, RESTful APIs specifically, but I don't know how to code, or I want to learn how to code. Where do I start? And that's a question I get all the time, both inside my organization and outside, and it's really hard, right? So I'm sure I'm not the only one that's been doing this for 20, 25 years. It's not an easy thing to take 20, 25 years, or even 2 or 5 years, and condense it into a quick and effective conversation that empowers someone else to do what you do. It's not an easy thing to do. I will say though that there are so many tools out there. It's not hard, and obviously there's a lot of information on this slide too. But all of these tools make it really easy to minimally understand how to what an API is. How do I use it? What's it do for me? So quick drilling down this slide. Yes, you can. You can educate yourself on a new technology. You can develop and prove workflows prior to coding, like the whiteboarding example that I mentioned earlier. And you can document that stuff for distributed coding. So there are a lot of tools available that you can leverage, that I leverage every day, that allow more agile development. I can tablecloth or napkin or whiteboard a workflow and pull it apart and make sense out of it and prove it out before actually writing code. And a couple of them are really, really popular, right? Postman is very popular. It's simply an HTTPS based. It allows you to make outbound calls and view the results, and you can use it to access any API. I think I have it on a screen right here. If we break out of there, let's see here. Yeah, here it is. So this is actually hitting the Rubrik API and getting some information on VM. So the endpoint that I'm hitting, VMware/VM, is showing me a bunch of metadata that I have for a particular, for actually all virtual machines that are backed up in our lab environment. So I can go in and do things like, let's get more information on a VM. So I'm not coding, I'm just copying stuff between endpoints. So if I do that, I'm now diving into this particular VM and getting more details, what host it's running on, what path it is in VMware, both infrastructure and folder path, things like snapshots. So when did we make backups? Data like that becomes available, and you can bench this and prove out theories well before you even touch a bit of code. And another item that I mentioned here, Swagger and Apogee is another one, and IODocs is probably, I don't know if IODocs is very popular anymore. I'm not quite sure. But Swagger IO is definitely, the Open API standard is definitely leaning towards that as a documentation source, right? So we have a similar interface to that, and there are hybrids out there. There are custom ones. VMware's new API browser is it's way better than the old one, and hopefully they continue to progress to make their API extremely useful. So Swagger allows you to do very similar things to Postman, except you have all the endpoints there, so you can actually drill down and make, this is essentially the same call that I was making within Postman, but it's all there, it's on the screen, we can see what's going on. And then if we authenticate, we can actually hit this try it out button, which is really cool because it lays everything out for you. It tells you if you run this curl command, you're going to get this information. So you can easily prove these theories out, these workflows out, well before you develop any code.
So you're saying curl is the best thing ever?
I'm not going to say that. I whatever. I mean, it depends on what tools you're comfortable using. You can certainly use curl and pipe a bunch of stuff all over the place, and bash script to your heart's content. It's not necessarily the way that I'd go, but it's definitely possible. It's something you can do.
So we had a question about authentication.
Yeah.
And so someone asked, is there something similar to like an SSH key that can be used safely over the internet instead of using like a username and password?
Yeah, so that's what I was getting to. A lot of like third-party SaaS products, they'll lean towards things like API keys, right? So that's a long string. I'm not sure what they're using to encrypt that string yet. but it's essentially an ID that you configure in the said SaaS provider's interface to provide you with an API key to connect to that API.
Cool.
So it's kind of similar to token based, but it's longer living.
Cool.
That makes sense? Cool.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So that's my Swagger spiel. Let's go back to this little thing that we threw together. And obviously, you know, to Rebecca's point, you can just use curl if that's what you want to do, right? Most of the Swagger interfaces will have all those commands available, and you'll be able to test them out, and it'll be fun stuff. So moving on for that, we went over the Swagger interface, we went over Postman. All right, so calling a RESTful API. It's really, so I divided this into two sections. Let's preface it with the kinds of things that we can call it with, right? So there's not a huge amount of requirements to a REST API because it's predictable. It's something that's documented. It's something that, you know, in a controlled continuous deployment environment, it's something that wouldn't ordinarily change. So it's something you can depend on. So that being said, you can write in anything that allows an outbound REST call, even some things that don't. If you chose to write, you know, a bash script to run, pardon me, to run a series of workflows, you could absolutely do that and leverage curl to act as your request library. That's something that I've seen out there. It's not as structured as other things, but for sure, it's pretty much, it's literally pick your poison. So I tend to write in anything that the use case requires, but you don't have to do that. If Ruby is your favorite language, you can do everything in Ruby. If PowerShell is your favorite language, you can do everything in PowerShell. I'm kind of on the debate of whether PowerShell is a language yet. I probably just shot myself in the foot. But yeah, you can essentially use anything that allows you to trigger an outbound request, an outbound REST request, and design your workflows in those languages or several at the same time.
Haters gonna hate, man, with PowerShell.
I'm probably gonna put my foot in my mouth a couple of times. When
I hope
PowerShell.
that's like the most quoted like clickbait from this presentation.
All right. So this is really a picture of what, or a very basic representation of what a RESTful API can offer you in terms of functionality, right? So on the right, we have some RESTful APIs. It doesn't matter what they are. They're just RESTful APIs. So we have our own Rubrik RESTful API. We have vCenter, obviously, and the whole V stack, figuratively. And then I threw a question mark in there because it really don't matter. It can be AWS. It can be whatever you use in your business process, in your technology stack. So having that RESTful API really enables all of the business logic to be built in any of those 8 solutions for sure, and tons more. So my team has been able to develop integrations between RESTful APIs for Puppet, for Chef, for Ansible, for ServiceNow, for VRA, obviously, for PowerShell. Actually, that's Chris Wall's module. Within Ruby, within Python, we pretty much go out there and you know, based on the client environment, we kind of assess what the tool set is and how we need to build, how we need to develop the solution, whether it's JavaScript or Python or Ruby or whatever language the business logic tool, whether it's configuration management or service portal, we kind of play into the needs of that specific topic or specific business case. And it's really cool because with any of those items on the business logic side, with ServiceNow, if you have a mid server on premises, we can do some really cool stuff with that, provided that we have the endpoints to hit to provide that functionality. So this is what I was getting at when I said that this is kind of hard. So it's really hard to say writing code and then simple. And that's my nature. I tend to overcomplicate things. So it's really hard to do. So I kind of threw it out like this, right? So obviously you want to authenticate because you have to identify yourself, right? And because people, everyone's cool and all, but not that cool. So they're going to want to know who you are and if you're allowed to get stuff, and then you can get something. So essentially, what that means is I'm making a direct call, and I'm expecting some form of data back. So I'm gonna use this as a demonstration of that process happening. So I have a bit of Ruby code that I kind of base some of the frameworks, depending on the environment, that I prove out. It's kind of like a basic framework. So it handles the authentication, it handles session management. I actually have the option to specify within this code whether I want to use token-based authentication or basic, because I found the need that having it dynamic, having the option to use either basic or token, can get me out of a lot of jams. So I have that exercise in here. I can kind of show that code at some point if time permitting. But essentially what I'm doing here is, and I'll show the code in a moment, is saying, hey, let's go to this RESTful API and get some information. So I'm hitting an endpoint. In this case, I believe it is internal stat storage or something like that on our appliance, so our own RESTful API at Rubrik. And essentially what that's passing me back is the latest metrics that it has regarding space available on our unit. And I can go and do time series stats. I actually don't remember how I did that. So I'm going to go like this because help is fun. And if I say metric runway, I can see how many days are left on the device and various other tidbits, time-based stats, that kind of thing. If you want to integrate with your monitoring system, you can run something like if I go, let's go here, let's go metric, let's go IO stat, and we'll say 1D is in 1 day, and I think this will work. So that spits out in a complex hash of various timing points and what the IO was, or the input and output metrics were on the device at those times, so that you can go and integrate with your monitoring system, have it pull this command and do the math to create all the pretty graphs and stuff that everyone wants. So essentially, to make that call, I'll go into the actual code. I have a bunch of requirements, and we'll go into complex workflows in a little bit. But if I go to metrics, they're very simple calls. So I'm specifying the set of credentials that I'm using, which in this case is Rubrik credentials, and I have essentially a function that kind of breaks out all of the various types of calls that we can do. Whether it's a get, a post, a delete, a patch, whatever it is, and it kind of handles all that process. I'm a firm believer in code once, code right, and not a fan of duplicate code. I think I've mentioned this to Rebecca like 3 times over the past day, and it really helps you out because you don't have to change this get from API function ever. And you can just throw endpoints at this, and you get a data set back, and it really becomes a simple matter of gluing the pieces together, right? So that's what I have for simple, and it doesn't look that simple, but that's the best I got on. So okay, so here's where it gets infinitely more complicated based on what your use case is, right? So writing code in advanced fashion, I kind of gave you a taste of, code gets busy. It gets, when you get use cases, if you have a single code base, it kind of, it can complicate things. So there are tools out there to help you to simplify this. And we're going to go over the following topics in order to kind of give you a primer on what's out there and what they are, right? So I have 5 points that I like to keep in mind when I write something. And they're just things that you need to be aware of. It doesn't matter which way to go. If you go distributed version control is definitely something that I would recommend because it's way cooler and it's very mature and it's something that enables a layer of functionality that doesn't necessarily exist, or it requires more management to exist if you have a central version control system. Distributed simply means that it's normally hosted elsewhere. It's a place that you can hit when you're on the internet, but if you're not on the internet, you can still develop. You still have the code locally on your machine, and obviously Git is a prime example of that. And if you loop in something like GitHub, which is a very popular repository, there are others. There's Bitbucket. I think there are a handful of them out there, but Bitbucket and GitHub are by far the more popular ones. And you can tack on functionality on top of it once your code is checked in. We'll go into that briefly in a little bit. So another important aspect, and it's very easy to get caught on this one because it's really easy to hack out code and just have no real structure to it, right? And that's kind of what leads to the pet peeve that I kind of mentioned earlier, which is duplicate code. And I'll probably mention it 3 times on this discussion as well. So monolithic coding is the act of, in its basic form, it's I have one file that does everything, and when something breaks, everything's broken, which is not cool. And so we'll go into some details on that, some pros and cons between monolithic versus and dependency chaining, which is kind of just functioning things out or classing them out, however you decide to do it for your use case. We'll take a quick look at workflows and pipes, as well as error handling, which is obviously an important thing. And then we'll take just a rough view into CI and CD, actually both CDs, because there are 2 CDs. We'll look at those models and kind of how they play into your use of RESTful APIs. So version control, right? So central, I kind of did a high level of it. This tends to give a slight bit more of detail. That tends to be useful in selecting how you're going to manage your code. So centralized version control is something that's it tends to be a little old school at this point in time. I don't use it anywhere, but it's something to be aware of. If it's in your environment, if you have clients and it's in their environment, it's something that you should be aware of. And typically, although some of the legacy central version control systems, they've kind of added some distributed functionality to their software, which is really cool. But by and large, I would recommend going distributed. The reasons are pretty obvious, right? So it's very simple to do a git pull and get the latest code, and then hop on an airplane and continue writing code. It's something that's very mature. There are a lot of add-on functionalities that you can put on it to invoke testing. Travis is a fine example of that, and I can actually show you. Yeah, I probably have it here actually. Let me see if I still have it up. Yeah, so here's a sample of a Puppet module that we have within Rubrik. So it essentially instantiates a box, a VM, to allow me to run testing. This particular testing is based on the RSpec framework, which is with break spec, which is pretty well standard. And this particular test just runs a lint against the code. But I have other ones that actually go in and run unit tests on all of the aspects of code. So going back here, obviously these are the three major distributed version control systems, and they're Git, Mercurial, and Perforce. Git's by and large the leader. I have another deck that I did with actual numbers of the repos on these various systems, and Git just blows everything else out of the water. Sorry, GitHub blows everything else out of the water down here. So, nope, jumped ahead. So obviously the repositories, you can use whatever you want. A lot of them support multiple types of version control systems. But they're obviously the big names are GitHub, Bitbucket, SourceForge. SourceForge, I'm not sure if they support Git yet, but I'm sure they'll get there as well. So monolithic or dependency change. So it's easy to hack something out, like I said, in monolithic form. It's really easy to start a set of code because you see it on one screen, and you can quickly get something done, and everyone wants to get something done. The bad parts of it are we can't collaborate unless you're working on my machine with me, and that's never really much fun. The code base tends to get really ugly because it's just you. There's no one's over your back checking what you're doing. It's your writing and yours alone. So anyone else who looks at it, unless you have impeccable programming skill, they could get confused. I mean, there are cases in the past where I've actually, had a bad day or whatever, and I'd code in French, and that kind of irritated some people. So it's really not it's not ideal when you get into larger projects, larger integrations, where there are many workflows that quite possibly many people might be working on, and no one wants to monkey patch. I mean, it's really hard to say, hey, I have this really vital piece of software that's my junk that is about 2,000 lines of code in one file, and I forgot to, I forgot to put a quote in. It's not cool to see things like that break. So obviously I don't lean towards the monolithic side. In the past, it had been something, when I hack something out really quick, it's not a long workflow, it might be okay, but by and large, I would definitely go with something with dependencies built into it. So the obvious pros to dependency chains are everything that monolithic is not, right? So we can split the workload amongst the team. So I can be working on, storage vMotions or some particular process, and then another person can be working on, maybe I have the same set of code that's doing some other VMware hackery or running a backup or any other process that might need to happen at the same time. If I was agile and I had a team of developers, it would be relatively easy based on these dependency chains to split the work up amongst the team and either build that into our CI workflow as rigid splits based on branching, or not, but we would have the ability to work on things separately. Modules are independent, so that's a really cool thing, right? So the point is, if a module is broken and your code, a portion of your code doesn't call that module, that piece of code is going to run just fine. When your main framework is reliant or dependent on a module that is broken, it'll probably break. But through logging and just analyzing the command line, you can relatively easily determine which module that is and pinpoint your problem pretty quickly. And obviously, I probably should have had those two reversed in the opposite order. But unit integration and regression testing is really the key. When you have a lot of hands in the pot, scrutiny is pro. I mean, you want to, and we'll go into that in a little more detail shortly, but you absolutely want to scrutinize code. The con is longer to first iteration. It'll take a little while longer to get things organized. And it's not simple for new developers. It's a culture thing. It's something that needs to be handled gently. Yep. So workflows and pipes. This is really where it gets exciting, right? So now you know how to connect to an API. You can get some stuff. What do I do now? And this can get really complicated. This is where my head just goes nuts. So I several times today, where DevOps days in Detroit, I've had conversations with folks that I've never met before, and we get into discussing their environments and the possibilities of what our company can bring to the table. And right away, my gears start turning to the most complex use cases based on the conversation. And a lot of times it leads to, we're sitting there for 15, 20 minutes having this conversation. So in short, workflows and pipes enable you to perform a sequence of many API calls to achieve a goal or an end state. And I say this in this slide and the next slide. You have to ensure that you're using all the tools in your toolbox. I mean, even if you have equipment or SaaS systems or whatever the case may be, leverage everything you have in terms of APIs. Integrate, because it makes life so much better, and firefights are less, and everyone's just happy at the end of the day. So that's a basic, the basic premise of workflows and pipes. So I'm going to show you a little. This is kind of one of the recent use cases within Rubrik of a workflow that I was somewhat challenged with, but we got it done, and it worked really well. And in this case, we had a client come to us and say, hey, we used to swing run in order to move VMs from vCenter 5.5 to 6.5. But that didn't go so good last time we did it. And they wound up losing some VMs, which is not a good thing to happen when you have an agile deadline, when you have to get things migrated. And we were talking in the number of tens of thousands of VMs that they needed to migrate from vCenter 5.5 to 6.5. So essentially, all of the items underneath the arrows are operations that we built the workflow for to happen autonomously. And the good thing about with the Rubrik is that we can minimize downtime. If we leverage our incident recovery feature, we're essentially eliminating the risk of a swing run, and we're enabling some other functionality here. Like, you're going to have a 2-minute downtime. Is that okay? If you have a machine that takes a little while to boot up, it might be slightly longer. So the end result, and I can give you a quick look at this. I don't know, Rebecca, I'm probably wanting to go into demos shortly. So I can go into a quick code view of what that workflow looks like. And it's based on this same framework. It really lets me develop really fast. So if I go into lib, I'll see, trying to catch myself up. So I have some threading functionality in the core of this particular application. So in Rubrik.rb, I actually leveraged the celluloid suite to inhibit the threading. And the reason I chose that particular thing instead of native OS threading was because I wanted the customer to be able to run it on anything. and celluloid is very cross-platform effective. It's very portable. So you notice that I call the subclass of celluloid here because I reference some functions that are within celluloid, or some variables rather. So you'll see I kind of marked this up so that it really kind of, let me see if I can reduce this slightly so I can make the window bigger. Yeah, don't quite make it, but that's okay. So I kind of marked this up. There's some code in there that I kind of took out of the loop, but for the most part, we can walk through the entire workflow. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm marking the start of the workflow. I'm going in, I'm refreshing the vCenter that said VM is on. I actually passed the VMs in this, the VM object array are the actual details on the particular VM that I'm migrating. So I'll do one at a time, but I have a layer of abstraction above this that allows you to thread it to whatever arbitrary number you want to set it to. I mean, obviously you want it to be a realistic number. I think in the case of the actual run of this code, we had it either to 8 or 16 at a time, so it was pretty rapid. You see right in this line, we're actually kicking off an API call. So I'm getting the IDs of the vCenters, and for each of them, I'm going to go in and refresh them. And that's essentially what I'm going to do in this line here, which is another API call. So essentially there I'm getting the status of a vCenter refresh, and I'll confirm that and check it from time to time until it's succeeded. So after that vCenter is refreshed, I'm going to shut down the VM and monitor it till completion. Now I'm not going to go into details on the VMware calls. I'm essentially leveraging RBVMomi. There's one for Python. It's a similar third-party integration with the VMware SDK stack, and it's a fairly powerful library in lieu of the actual VMware API coming up to a more acceptable level. And obviously this was vCenter 5.5. So I couldn't even use that in this case. So I stuck with that library in order to get this done. So I shut it down, monitor it till it's complete, and that's actually in another function that I broke out into another actual file. I disconnect the CDs. That's actually a lie. What I do is I set it to client-side device. I don't disconnect it because that actually doesn't do it. And the reason for that is, later in the process, I actually vMotion or I can vMotion back to production storage off of our Rubrik when we recover it. So I removed some custom configs. In the case of this client, they were using IBM's Cloud Orchestrator, which is kind of a derivative of OpenStack's stuff. And they chose not to use it anymore. So we needed to go and remove that. In vCenter, you see the managed by nonsense. So we kind of wrote something in here to remove that because that extension would not be available on 6.5. And if it's not available on 6.5, then we can't light up the VMs. So then I'll go and snapshot the VM and monitor it until it's complete. So essentially what I'm doing here is more API calls. I have the ID of the machine in the VM object hash. I have the name of the machine in the VM object hash, and then I'll go and request this find VM item by name function. Actually launches a REST call that is more generalized. It says, hey, I just want this one piece of data on a VM name. So search for the VM on Rubrik in this case, and send me back the ID of that VM. I'll then figure out its SLA domain. So in Rubrik, if you're not familiar with that, we have this concept of SLA domains, which is kind of the new you can call it protection policy. In legacy products, it's kind of a backup job, or however you categorize your metrics or your variables, how often things are backed up, how long we keep them for in whatever your backup solution is. So we call it an SLA domain because we tend to simplify that type of thing in our solution. So I'll go in and I'll say, hey, look at this SLA hash, which, by the way, I do in the main script, which is a hash of SLA names and IDs, and see what that maps to in terms of this VM. So I kind of hang on to what the SLA domain is. Then I'll actually go in and request the machine be snapshot, which is essentially a CVT-based incremental. On a small to medium use machine, it'll take about 2 minutes to complete that. I'll monitor that through to completion, and that's what you see here. While it's not succeeded, I'll keep pinging it for status. If it's not succeeded, it'll spit out an error. Then I go and retrieve the ID of that snapshot that I just created. So the end game is to recover this machine to the 6.5 stack. So essentially here I'm saying, hey, I just backed it up. Let me know what the ID of that snapshot was, so that I can go and subsequently, and you'll see that a couple lines down, launch that instant recovery, which is essentially the Rubrik saying, hey, let's take this VM, throw it on an NFS export, and share it out as a data store to the vCenter server. In this case, the vCenter 6.5 server. So essentially, what I do here, this is a little bit confusing. It's definitely there's zero RESTful API, but it's a little bit of craftsmanship that goes through all of the VMware hosts and figures out, while that VM is preparing itself, which ones are in maintenance mode. So obviously, maintenance mode, like, yeah, you can promise that things are not going to be in maintenance mode, but if you have 100 ESXi hosts, things happen, right? So we built something in line to check them for maintenance mode and deduce them from the hash of available VMware hosts that we can instantly recover to with the Rubrik. So once that's done, this line, my H, is actually selecting. So sample is an object in Ruby that allows you to essentially randomize which of the array elements you're going to present. So in this case, I grab one sample from the HL array, which is essentially just telling me, hey, I selected this host to recover VM2. So then I'll go in and actually kick off the instant recovery, which is, we're back to REST, which is kind of cool. So essentially, I'll take all that information that I gathered up the chain, and that's why workflow in PowerShell and obviously in Linux, there's piping too. I think that it's taken a bit of a turn in PowerShell in the way it's used. But those are the things that we really accomplish. We're really getting information to perform, following workflows. So what comes after getting all that information? So we just got a bunch of information to initiate what we call an instant recovery, which is that, exporting the VM over NFS as a data store and launching launching that VM on an ESXi host, and having it visible in vCenter and all. So essentially, I do that same thing. So I launch the instant recovery. You'll see here you have the latest snapshot right here, and then just / instant recovery. So I'm sending a post request to it, and I'm specifying a couple things here, right? So it's really hard to read, but here I'm specifying the name of the machine, and here I'm specifying what I randomly sampled from that large host array that we had already deduced maintenance mode host from. I'm taking that machine ID and saying, hey, instant recover it to that particular hypervisor server. I'll kick that off. The Rubrik will do its thing, and I'll monitor that until it's complete. So this is a bunch of stuff that I wasn't a fan of, and we have to change the workflow on the fly to match their environment. But essentially what happened here was we we had a couple of options. We could either start the VM as it was instantly recovered, and then vMotion it to the production storage. And you see that's actually simplified. We essentially have a set of creds for the 6.5 vCenter or 2 vCenter, and we send it that VM object, and it'll go and migrate it to the data store that was defined in the feeder CSV, which is essentially a CSV file of what machines they wanted to move in a particular batch, and what port groups and data stores they were going to land on, and we set all that stuff dynamically. So what we found out when we actually implemented this is that there was an issue with the deployment that didn't allow me to mass instant recovery, and we're not sure. We think it was tied to the landing storage. We're not quite sure where that was. We resolved the issue, but that's actually being root caused now. So I actually, when we went live with this and tested it, we used our export method. So it was actually a data copy from the Rubrik to the ESXi cluster, the relevant data store, and then we lit the machine up. The good news is we tested all this. We can leverage both pieces of functionality, and we can likely hit. I'm going to throw a number out there, and I'm going to hold myself to it. But over the course of a weekend, we can do well over 1,000 machines, migrate 1,000 machines between those two systems with minimal downtime. It depends on the use case, but we can specify things like use export for smaller VMs because they're not going to take a long time anyway, and then you use live mount for the multi-terabyte VMs that we want running faster than the files are going to copy. So we can do that kind of thing. So we're running tight on time, Rebecca. How are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, take your time. I know you don't have that many slides left, so.
Yeah, there are a few. I can kind of breeze through this stuff. I do want to show the specific VRA integrations that we have because that's really cool stuff. But yeah, let's breeze through this stuff. So obviously, error handling is key. I think the more information that you provide, and I'm not talking about million-line log files daily, but very focused messages, right? So if you're expecting something back and you get something else, you should really know that. And then you should make decisions based on it. Maybe it's an error that doesn't really matter. Maybe the process still runs okay. And you can make judgment calls on how to continue the workflow or retry it or give up. There are definitely cases where maybe there's some network connectivity issue because it's always the network. And you can make those decisions, but you need to have the workflow in your code to be able to make the right decision. And obviously, the log. I can't say it enough. If you have the information, you can go back and root cause and deduce what the actual issue might be. I think I missed a slide. Yeah, I did. So continuous integration, delivery, deployment. I don't think there are a lot of people who really know like the differences. It's really an easy way to differentiate delivery and deployment, but people confuse the terms all the time. It's pretty funny. So continuous integration is very much a front end thing, right? So I stole this thing from, I think it's from GitHub actually, this picture, and it really says it pretty nicely, right? So your green, you can figure, is your master branch, and all of the other colors are different people doing different things. So the idea of CI is that everyone's contributing to the same code base, so it's really good collaboration. And even more so, once it's put up on the repo of choice, in our case, GitHub, you can institute things like some rudimentary testing or more detailed testing. If you want to do unit testing on every commit, you can do things like that. So continuous integration, it's good. Everyone should be doing it. Even if you're just a lone developer, you should definitely have a lot of the principles of continuous integration in place, or at least in your mindset. So the CDs, it's really, I don't know who I stole this. I'm really good at stealing pictures because I'm too lazy to do my own. But the picture really defines what they are, right? And they're very close. So continuous delivery is everything up until pushing the red button, everything up until actually pushing things to production. No matter which, it really doesn't matter how your deployment methods work. They're essentially mirrored between continuous delivery and continuous deployment. It's the same thing. The difference is when you get to pushing that red button. So continuous delivery doesn't include that, whereas continuous deployment would include things like whatever your deployment strategy is. So if you do blue-green, I don't know, I've heard a million of them, new ones every day. Rolling, canary, which is more of a metered kind of test the waters before you push everything in full production. You can do that kind of thing. And the most important thing on the slide is it's about continuous scrutiny, right? You need to, the more you interrogate your code overall, the better the product is going to be. And the quicker the quicker you actually deploy that culture in your organization or in your personal coding style, you're going to find the product's going to be really good. So yeah, I gave a little view of Ruby bits. I think I'll probably skip the Cloud Bolt so that we don't go too far over here. I appreciate everyone hanging out. But I do want to show the VRA VRO stuff because that's pretty cool. And it's a lot of fun to do that kind of thing, right? So I'm gonna find somewhere. I have let me go here. I lied about that questions thing. I just clicked.
So while you're logging in, we had two things. First, someone made a joke that they said their developers could not even spell CI/CD.
That's funny.
And then someone asked if you can go over what JSON parse does.
So JSON parse essentially takes, that's a good point. Let me do that real quick. Sorry for not being overly descriptive on that. So essentially JSON parse takes out, we're going to see it all over the place, but I think we were looking at migrate for that. Oh, it's right there. I didn't even need to do that, but we'll do it anyway. So JSON parse essentially takes the output or the result set from this particular, in this case, it'll take it from this particular API call, and it'll expect JSON back and translate it to the native Ruby hash algorithm, to the way Ruby hashes work, right? So it's really just a translation from JSON to native Ruby hash. This exists in most of the programming languages. It's very rare that you need to actually write a function to do it yourself. This is actually an out-of-box gem that exists with the Ruby installation. Does that answer the question? Hopefully.
So far, no response. So go ahead and keep going.
I'm going to assume that's okay. So this is our pretty standard kind of VRA deployment within our lab at Rubrik. And you'll see my icons aren't popping up. They're supposed to be pretty icons. You'll see a series of day two operations or actions based on these machines. And the one that I really wanted to point out, obviously we can do things like have an end user do a backup as self-service and monitor it through to completion. They'll know when it's done. For instance, if a user wants to patch their system, has that ability, so they want to make sure it's backed up prior to doing that, they can launch it on demand. It takes about a minute and a half because it's all CBT based once again. And then the user will know when, by looking at their request log and refreshing that, they'll know when that snapshot's done and they can go and do their work. Other functions that we offer are the ability for an end user to select their own SLA domain. So if you have you have specific levels of compliance for your backups, that onus or that risk, or however you want to handle that, or however you want to title that, is kind of put in the users. It's their function. So they'll need to make sure that they're compliant with their own policies, instead of you managing a bunch of jobs. Live mount, we can launch as a VM. We can launch any of the previously backed up versions of it. It'll light it up off of network. It'll be accessible through the vCenter console, essentially. But the cool thing, and I love showing this, I love logging in and then showing that, is we have this ability to, much in the way that macOS has the what do they call it? Time machine functionality. We can extend that and to the end users in much the same way. So it might not be as pretty because I did it instead of Apple. But essentially what I can do is I can go and select the VM, go to instant recovery. Oh, my icons were really cool. And go and select a snapshot. So let's say use cases, ransomware attack Sunday night. Come in Monday morning, find it as an end user, and I'm scared. So essentially what this allows me to do is go back to last Friday's version of the machine. And there are some business principles that we wrap around this. So it's not a free-for-all. You can't do whatever you want, Mr. Customer or Mr. End User, or however your support model works. But they can go and select a snapshot, and then either you can leave these options or set them as business requirements. For instance, maybe you want to snapshot the current state of the machine so that you can go back and root cause the issue. Maybe it's a bigger issue. It's connected to a series of events that you've noticed. I don't know, whatever the use case might be. You'd have the option as a business to specify that the machine is backed up prior to being recovered. And this will actually reach out to the Rubrik to get, don't mind our silly naming here, to get the list of SLA policies that you have defined for your client. You might want to specify one specifically for root causing these issues and set all this statically. That's totally okay too. So that adds about 1.5 minutes to the process, based on average CVT backups. For higher utilization machines, obviously that's going to be a little bit longer. So then I provide the option to actually launch the vMotion. So that's a simple checkbox. It's going to migrate it to wherever the original DevOps 1009 was located, whatever data store it was located on, and we can go and kick that off. So I'm actually going to launch that, because that's really the last thing that I need to show, and then we can kind of host a couple of questions or something. So I'll go and launch that, and obviously, when the request is in, the user can kind of monitor it through this interface, and this is obviously a lab, so excuse the number of failures that you see, because if I don't fail, I don't succeed. And we can see that it's actually recovering the machine already. It'll also tell the user when the machine is accessible, and then they can go and log into said machine. So don't mind my broken flash icon, but you can see that it actually powered on 9:38. Yep, that's correct time. So it already has the machine powered on, so it's probably up already. TikTok.
So you did all of this using JavaScript and VRO?
Yeah, this is all JavaScript and VRO. We'll actually take a look at that real quick. I think that's it. Yeah, this is a workflow running up. This is one that I ran before to make sure my stuff wasn't broken. So essentially, this is a VRO workflow. You can see this particular recovery. I hate when it does that. It's actually monitoring the Rubrik instant recovery right now. which is why it keeps hopping to the sub workflow here, where it's kind of pinging through the statuses. It actually makes a REST call up here and then makes decisions based on what the response is there. Then it kind of goes into it goes into a 10-second wait. So that's what we're waiting on now to complete. So essentially walking through the workflow really quickly. Oh, here we go. Now it's another sub workflow. So it's essentially, if I ask it to run the on-demand, I run a sub workflow that runs the on-demand snapshot. Then I'll get the snapshot ID of that particular backup, the backup that's being requested to be recovered. Then I'll go through, do you want to vMotion the VM? Pardon me. If you do, I'll grab the data store that it's currently residing on prior to instant recovering it. Then I'll go and actually launch the instant recovery off Rubrik, monitor it to completion, which is the function that we were looking at before. If I chose not to vMotion the machine, I'll just exit out. If I have chosen to vMotion the machine based on business principles or however that decision's made, I'll go and disconnect any CDs that might be mounted to the machine, because vMotion don't like that kind of thing. I'll actually, like I lied here too, like I did earlier, I set it to a client-side device so that it eliminates that as an issue. Then I'll actually perform the vMotion. So if we go back to the browser, we'll go to vCenter, we'll see it going. So there it is. So it's recovered the machine. The machine is accessible by the end user, but while, I mean, there might be some slight performance implications while it's vMotioning, but by and large, the user is good to go. And it's literally like, come in Monday morning, my machine's broken, and between fiddling with my Kluge interface and executing the request, in 5 minutes, they're up and running. And I think that is all the content that I had. Rebecca, do we have any other questions?
No. Tom, do we have any questions on Twitter that we've missed?
I'm not seeing any questions. There's a lot of good comments, especially someone saying you're guaranteeing Batman or Ride a Unicorn in your office if you adopt APIs. So I'm looking forward to that.
I mean, it really opens a huge amount of possibilities. It really gets my gears going in terms of things that we couldn't necessarily accomplish without a lot of kludgy, not nice code. So yeah, it's essentially that good.
There's a lot of thank yous for VRO.
Yeah, thanks for using VRO. So how did you code in French? I think that's an important question we all wanted to know.
I can curse on this, right? Sorry.
Sure, why not? In French, of course, right?
It was my wife is actually she's a French national, and actually she's a U.S. national too. Thank you. So it was kind of like I went to the School of Hard Knocks for learning French because I did the whole high school thing and I was not that good at it then. I'm certainly not much better at it now. But writing it's kind of fun, and confusing colleagues is one of my favorite sports. Although I kind of moderate that more nowadays. I try and keep things cool. But yeah, there were, back in the Perl days, there were cases where I'd actually write code in French because I had a bad day.
So remind me not to upset you at work. Got it.
Oh, I'm a totally different person. I mean, yes, but I think I'm a different person.
Cool. So no other questions have popped up. So thank you very much for your time tonight, Pete. And thank you for everybody who attended.
Thanks for having me, guys.